At least 5 buses of migrants pulled into Chicago over the weekend. More than 8,600 migrants are staying in the city's shelters, and at least 59% of them are Venezuelan, according to the Chicago Sun-Times. Since 2014, 7 million people have fled the country. That's roughly 20% of its population. 6 million of the refugees have made their homes in other Latin American or Caribbean countries. But an increasing number of migrants are choosing to make the dangerous 2,000-mile journey to the United States. In 2021, Customs and Border Protection encountered 50,000 Venezuelan migrants. This year, that number is over 250,000. For more, let's bring in CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, you encouraged our colleagues to look at Venezuela as a way of understanding what's happening at the border. Why did you do that?
Well, good evening, John. I think it has been overlooked that there is this historic displacement and refugee crisis here in the Western Hemisphere, in our region, in Latin America. As you mentioned and underscored, over 7 million Venezuelans have fled the economic collapse and authoritarian policies in Venezuela in recent years. That is not just the largest refugee crisis ever recorded in the Western Hemisphere, but it's now surpassed the refugee exodus from Syria and Ukraine. These are 2 countries with active war zones. So just think about that, about how large-scale this refugee crisis, John, is. Before, most Venezuelans were settling in countries like Colombia and other places in South America, like Peru and Chile. But increasingly, they are journeying here to the U.S.-Mexico border. In August, 22,000 Venezuelans entered Border Patrol custody. Now we're seeing 2,000 Venezuelans cross the U.S.-Mexico border each day. That's according to federal data obtained by CBS News. And tens of thousands of additional Venezuelans are on their way to the U.S. 63,000 of them crossed the notorious Darien jungle in Panama on their way to the U.S. in August alone, and those numbers are expected to continue climbing. And right now, the policy solutions and options for the administration and really any government are limited. The U.S. right now cannot deport Venezuelans to that country because the government there has strained diplomatic relations with the U.S. Mexico only accepts a limited number of Venezuelans. And lastly, John, Colombia so far has been unwilling to stop the flow into the Darien Gap.
So help me understand, Camilo, the difference with Venezuelans. The government has enacted temporary protected status and not asylum. Help me understand the distinction between those two.
That's a critical question, John. For those who don't know, asylum cannot be granted on a blanket basis to a large class of people. It is adjudicated on an individual or family basis. TPS, on the other hand, temporary protective status, can be granted to hundreds of thousands of people, like the Biden administration just did, if their home countries are experiencing a humanitarian crisis. Additionally, asylum is for those who are fleeing persecution because of certain factors like their religion, political views, or their race. Many Venezuelans would not qualify for asylum because poverty and economic hardship, no matter how extreme, are not grounds for asylum, John. So that's why the Biden administration has extended TPS for nearly 500,000 Venezuelans in the U.S. However, that does not benefit new arrivals. It only benefits those who arrived in the U.S. before July 31st. But there is some concern, John, that could encourage more Venezuelans to cross the U.S.-Mexico border because they could expect to qualify from the program, even though on paper that's not the case, John.
Right. So what efforts, so that takes care of that piece. What efforts then is the government trying to make to stem the flow, basically home country efforts that they're trying to do to, or other solutions that might be proposed to handle this?
Well, since they cannot return Venezuelans directly to Venezuela, John, the U.S. has been returning some Venezuelans to Mexico, but again, in limited numbers because that is the agreement with the Mexican government. It is also focusing on expanding the opportunities that Venezuelans have to come to the U.S. legally, mainly through a sponsorship program that allows Venezuelans, Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians to come to the U.S. if they have sponsors. However, John, many Venezuelans don't have the passports or U.S. sponsors needed to get to the U.S. under this program. And that's why we're seeing many of them come to the U.S. through the Darien Gap and at the U.S.-Mexico border. And those numbers, again, are expected to continue to increase because of the desperation amongst many of these Venezuelans and also the deteriorating conditions in many countries that are hosting them, such as Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru.
Immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Thanks, Camilo.